Well, in the middle of the 1990s, Tony Blair became the first Labour leader to admit that Margaret Thatcher got some things right. Today, as the 2001 election moves peacefully to its close, he said it was time for Britain to put Thatcherite things behind it. Labour's poster campaign may be trying to frighten the voters with William Hague wearing the Iron Lady's heavily lacquered hair, but the fact remains that when she went out campaigning today, the crowds were pushing forward to touch the hem of her garments. Our political editor, Martha Carney, reports on why the former leader is once again centre stage.
It could have been the 80s all over again. For some, memories of a halcyon age. Others recoiled as their bête noire resurfaced. Tony Blair found a third way.
It is time we moved beyond Thatcherism. Not that we reject everything that happened then, but that we start to realise what was also wrong with that period of time. And what was wrong was very clear. Economic instability, gross underinvestment in public services, social division, and an attitude to Europe that has no relevance to the modern world in which we live.
Today in Romford, Spike was the vanguard of a traditional Essex welcome for a Tory heroine. She seemed a bit touchy when I asked her about the Labour charge that the modern Conservative Party was just reheated Thatcherism.
What do you mean, just reheated?
It's clear Margaret Thatcher still has the power to draw a crowd, especially in Essex, one of the areas that helped sweep her to power in the first place. But nowadays, is she really such an advantage to the Conservative Party? And why does her philosophy still dominate British politics? For some, this is little short of a royal visit, which could work to William Hague's advantage.
I think it's a good thing he's using her, because a lot of people liked her tactics, and I think that's what his tactic may be. Get her in and I'll use some of her ideas that might win a few people over, I think.
But for others, the contrast between Margaret Thatcher and William Hague wasn't a favourable one.
I just felt she was a very strong personality. William Hague's coming across a little bit too soft. He's not saying we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Whereas Maggie Thatcher, what she said, she meant.
And the self-styled Return of the Mummy hasn't received favourable reviews elsewhere.
She was Prime Minister a long time ago. And I think if the last election, 1997, told us anything at all, the Tory party has to move on. And frankly, having the mummy return, as she herself said, gives me real reason to doubt. I mean, after all, when the mummy returned, cast terror amongst the nations. and to a certain extent, she has been, I think, a very disruptive figure in this campaign.
The more Mrs Thatcher appears in places like Romford, the better, according to the Labour campaign. But isn't Tony Blair's scorn a touch disingenuous? After all, there are certainly occasions when the two politicians sound distinctly similar. In the past, Tony Blair has expressed his admiration for the former Prime Minister. I believe Mrs Thatcher's emphasis on enterprise was right. She was a thoroughly determined person, and that's admirable. Today, Tony Blair acknowledged that there are part of the 80s agenda he'll keep. Presumably he means keeping a tight rein on inflation and the trade unions tamed. And there are those on the right who believe the Prime Minister's plans for a second term are distinctly Thatcherite.
Any party which doesn't accept the reforms that came under Mrs Thatcher in the 1980s is simply not going to get elected. The only reason Labour got elected last time was they did accept that reality. Indeed, if you look at their manifestos, they both contain distinctly Thatcherite policies. The Conservatives have some new Thatcherite ideas, and Labour promised to take Thatcherism into an area that she never did. She reformed the state industries, she reformed the state utilities, and she half-reformed the public services like health and education. And in the manifesto, Mr Blair makes it quite clear he's going to reform the other half.
So what does Lady Thatcher herself think? Lady Thatcher, is Tony Blair a true follower of Thatcherism, would you say?
I'm sure he is. I'm sorry, Tony Blair?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I thought I have no idea. He'll have his own idea. But you draw your own conclusions from the way he's governed in the last 4 years. And it hasn't, fortunately, been full-blooded socialism.
Really? Why do you say that?
Well, dear, it's obvious, isn't it? When I took over from full-blooded socialism, top rate of tax on investment income was 98%. Top rate of tax on earned income was 83%. We got rid of that.
So Tony Blair has been following your legacy?
No, I didn't go to that conclusion. He has not gone back to full-blooded socialism. Thank goodness. Britain would have suffered a great deal if he had.
Okay, excuse me.
Actually, a lot of those figures...
And on one area, Tony Blair last night sounded distinctly Thatcherite, on a traditional dividing line between left and right, closing the gap between rich and poor.
If you end up saying, no, actually my task is to stop the person earning a lot of money, you waste all your time and energy taking some money off the people who are very wealthy, when in actual fact, in today's world, they probably simply move elsewhere and make their money. And what you're not asking me about, but which would be a far more fruitful line of endeavour, is what are you doing for the poorest people in our society to give them a boost?
Well, let's talk a little bit about
Tony Blair's equivocation on that key issue of inequality has caused disquiet amongst a number of Labour candidates we spoke to today.
99% of the Labour Party does care about that. I think there has been a problem in that the gap has continued to grow over the past 3 to 4 years as we stuck to Conservative spending limits. Now, I think that when Tony Blair says that the manifesto is unremittingly New Labour, he does make another mistake, because people are prepared to give us a second chance. But I think they're prepared to do that because they want to see Labour deliver what it promised to do back in 1997. And that does mean that people who earn a great deal of money should be paying more in tax.
Now, Labour, I think, are presenting themselves in some ways as the natural heirs of Thatcherism until they hit this campaign, and they suddenly woke up to the fact, as we've argued for years, that most people want quality public services and know that that does mean fair taxation.
Later, there was a lighter note for Charles Kennedy, with a surprise streaker at his rally. Perhaps a suitable way to end a day when the main political debate has been about who's stolen whose political clothes.
And we're joined now for the last time in this election campaign by our panel, Shirley Williams, Matthew Taylor and Philip Oppenheim. Philip Oppenheim, why is it, do you think, that Lady Thatcher has risen from the grave in those last stages of the election campaign?
Well, I don't know why you think, Jeremy, anyone could stop her from doing so. I don't think even you could achieve that. I think the effect, though, is probably a zero-sum game. I think her presence probably energises the activists and the core voters on either end of the spectrum to come out and vote one way or the other. I think the 70% of people in the middle, the sort of undecided voters, probably look at the spectacle, see a sort of mildly batty old girl, think the whole thing's sort of slightly amusing, and that probably pretty much sums up her role in this election.
I think Philip's absolutely right about her appearance being good for all parties, in a sense. It's good for the Conservative strategy, which is fundamentally oriented to their core vote, but it's also good for Labour because it helps to get their heartlands out by reminding them there's a sort of left-right division. I think it plays pretty well in the seats where the Liberal Democrats are fighting the Conservatives. So peculiarly, her appearance is functional for everybody, which I think tells us something about this election campaign.
How is it for you, Shirley?
I don't completely agree with that. I think that Margaret Thatcher is the original celeb. I mean, she's, as it were, Marlene Dietrich to Madonna. And what she does, in a way, is to throw up William Hague's limitations. That's his problem, because she's so confident, so clear, so dogmatic, so certain that she's right, that in a way she makes him look a bit shaky and a bit over the top.
Now, to what extent do you think that Tony Blair is, in any sense, her heir?
He is partly. In character terms, absolutely not. I mean, he's a consensual politician, he's relatively timid, he's always keen to try and make sure that he's got everything going his way. He gets scared if it's not going his way. I mean, for a man with that majority to do effectively as little radical as he's done is amazing. But he is her heir to some extent in policy terms, I believe, because for one thing, he's deeply, deeply attracted by big business. He finds big business obviously seductive in an extraordinary sort of way. And he obviously, I think, too, is very keen on the idea of entrepreneurship in his country. In those ways, he's her child, but in terms of personality, not at all.
Philip Oppenheim?
I think Shirley's right. I think there are obvious areas where Blair has taken on the Thatcher consensus in the same way as the Tories took on the Attlee consensus in the 50s. There are great chunks of policy concentrating on indirect tax rather than direct tax, means testing of benefits. One could go on and on. But I think there are really crucial areas where they're different. Obviously, they're different in language. His language is more cuddly, Europe. But the real difference is Thatcher, whatever you thought of her, was radical, pushed forward, pioneering unpopular policies, whereas Blair really is a consolidator. He craves popularity, and despite the rhetoric, entirely agree with Shirley, has squandered a vast majority doing very little.
But I think that this underestimates the fact that there have been global trends in terms of the realignment of politics. You know, someone once said, I think it's broadly right, that the right won the economic argument, the left won the social argument, and the centre won the electoral argument. So all politicians of the centre-left have had to take on the sorts of economic policies which we associated with the right 15 years ago. I think Thatcher's reappearance tells us something else as well, actually. It reminds us this campaign is the end of a political alignment we've got used to for decades, in the sense that the Liberal Democrats have now moved to the left of Labour, but you wouldn't know that from where the trade unions are, their affiliation. The Conservatives, if they're going to get back into politics, have to change their attitudes to Europe, to public services, to social authoritarianism versus liberalism. We're going to see a huge realignment after this election campaign. Now, none of the leaders want to talk about it yet, because it's sort of quite helpful to them to be partly realigned, but also to be able to return to their core constituency. And Margaret Thatcher comforts us, makes us feel it's the same as it has been for the last 30 years, but things are going to change radically after the election.
Do you think there's a major realignment going on?
Yes, but the reason, I mean, I think that we are in mid-passage. We're like people looking at geodesic plates parting, because we've seen the amazing reform of the Labour Party, which I agree has gone to right of centre. We are now looking at the beginning of the reform of the Conservative Party, and the next 5 years will be dominated, I think, by a kind of 1981. What 1981 was the Labour Party, when Michael Foot was slaughtered, and when the SDP broke away. I think that's going to happen in the Conservative Party.
A lot of resonances for you, then, looking at what's happening in the Tory Party.
I actually think I'm looking in a reverse mirror, Jeremy. I can see the Conservative Party going through almost all the same agonies that we went through.
I fundamentally disagree with Shirley, actually. I don't think there's any chance of the party splitting. I think, though, the defeat is bad. They will look at themselves and they will say, in a sense, we have been too different from Thatcherism. Thatcher would have been much more radical. She would have pushed forward a new agenda. And the new agenda for the Tories, which Hague has not grasped, is to ally economic liberalism with Thatcher, which Thatcher brought back onto the agenda in the 80s, with economic social liberalism of the traditional kind, and they've missed some massive opportunities if you look at democratic reform of the Lords, decriminalisation of cannabis. These are the sort of opportunities Hague had to move in a new, more attractive, socially unauthoritarian direction, and he's failed. And I think if the Conservatives lose big, that is the direction
I think you've left out Macbeth's ghost. And what you've got walking through the politics of Britain is the spectre of Europe. And I cannot see how the Conservative Party can come together over the spectre of Europe as it dominates the whole of politics.
I think if there's a referendum, after the referendum, win or lose, it's a dead issue. It's
over like the next 2 years.
But it's not just an issue for the right, I think. The Liberal Democrats in this election are winning votes in areas of the southwest where they are still seen as the centre party, a safe protest vote. Now, if for much longer they continue to be seen as the most left-wing party in Britain, that support is going to fall away. You can't be the most left-wing party in policy terms and still be the centre party. Labour has similar sorts of issues, I think.
Where do you think a left-leaning 21-year-old ought to be looking then?
I think a left-leaning 21-year-old probably won't join a political party. But actually, if you look at it policy by policy, then if you're going for the most left-wing party, as I did when I was 21, you join the Liberal Democrats now.
Charlie Williams, that is going to make life very different and difficult for you.
I beg to differ in one crucial point.
Yes,
I think that we often use the phrase left-wing to mean statist. Clearly, the Liberal Democrats are not statists. They're not nationalisers. They're not. They want more public spending, but they're also deeply, deeply addicted to the concept of civil liberties and liberalism. We differ from the Labour Party.
Depends on your definition of liberalism, Shirley, really. It's a modern sort of liberalism. It's not the liberalism, I think, that, with respect, that Gladstone would understand.
I think exactly that.
It's not an affection for real personal liberty, because I think the social agenda...
Could you do less?
I think with the Liberal Democrats, the social agenda...
The only party willing to talk about a Royal Commission on drugs, the only party willing to talk about maintaining trial by jury...
But when it comes to social policy, personal freedoms go out of the window in the cause of the greater good of social...
But to young people, the Liberal Democrats certainly appear to be the most radical party in relation to a set of what we associate with being youth issues, not just liberalism, but also environmentalism and a whole set of other issues. So those things are going to change. There's a lot of people now who continue to support the Labour Party because it's been the club they've supported all these years. The next generation, without that sort of baggage, will look across, and I think we're going to see realignment. It's going to raise big issues, not just for young people, also for the trade unions. You know, they're affiliated to a party that wants to go further in terms of public-private partnerships, and the Liberal Democrats want to go more modest in terms of tax and spend than the Liberals are. I think there's going to be huge shifts in the next few years, and this whole election campaign it's a process of people clinging on to the old certainties as they disappear from under them.
That's exactly right. But to me, one of the fascinating questions is where in that whole spectrum the Conservative Party places itself. And I'd go one other step further than you, Matthew. I think that the spectrum of politics has changed. It used to be left-right in traditional terms, with the communists at the one end and the fascists at the other. I think we have to look at the authoritarian, libertarian dimension as well.
But authoritarianism, and when you talk about authoritarianism, you've got to remember it's not just a matter of personal liberty issues, like decriminalisation of cannabis, like freedom of information. It's also the extent to which you wish to regulate business and people's personal and social lives. Yep. And I think the trouble with the Liberals and New Labour is they're very regulationist when it comes to business and people's personal and social lives. The way forward for the Conservatives is to ally economic liberalism with social and personal freedom and become the non-authoritarian party of freedom as a counterpoint to what is increasingly seen as a bossy, stressy, hectoring New Labour and occasionally Social Democratic.
Well, Miss Widdicombe, you have a job saying that.
Not if they thought they could win, Matthew. Not if they thought it was a winning argument.
Well, they're a long way away from that.
No one is thinking the party is going to go forward with Anne Widdecombe as its leader. That is not on the agenda.
Anne Widdecombe is,
Sorry to disappoint you.
Let me ask you about the Times editorial this morning. The Times, the first time in the history of the Times. It's no longer, of course, the paper it once was, in the sense of being the voice of the establishment. For the first time in its history, it's coming out for a Labour victory, and it's doing so implicitly or explicitly in places on the grounds that Blair is the natural inheritor of Thatcherism.
I think they're partly right. I think it was an interesting, slightly wordy leader, and I think their point was that Blair has taken on a lot of Thatcher's policies, but I think the key thing is Blair is a consolidator. He craves popularity where Thatcher was radical. She didn't really, crave popularity, and she did that quite successfully, and that, I think, is the big difference.
What did you make of it, Matthew?
I thought it was a bit of a modelled argument, and I'd take a risk here because we don't want to get on the wrong side of the Times. But to talk about Blair inheriting the Thatcher legacy, I mean, this is a government that is willing to talk about poverty, willing to talk about full employment, has reversed the process of taking powers away from trade unions and regulated employment a bit more. The lack of subtlety, I think.
Quickly, Shirley Williams.
I was scared by it. I wondered, I couldn't help asking myself, what price is Tony Blair paying for this? And I think it might be an awfully high price.
Thank you all very much, and thanks for being with us during the campaign.
Retention and so on. But really the numbers, the sheer scale of the numbers we were talking about required large amounts of money and investment.
After keeping to Tory spending limits for 2 years, the government announced their third year would be the year of delivery. And certainly the spending increase over 3 years sounded huge.
Real doctors, the extra doctors in training are real, the extra nurses in the health service are real, the extra £21 billion is real.
But as Panorama reported, the real extra money was less than half the 21 billion. The government had used the same triple counting device as they had in claiming to have saved £1 billion in red tape. The real increase was 10.3 billion. At the start of the election campaign, the London Evening Standard asked the Prime Minister about Panorama's charge of triple counting.
Yeah, which is complete rubbish. Do you wish you'd been straight with us? No, we were absolutely straight. I mean, the Panorama thing was just a complete disgrace, because what they do is they just take a whole lot of things out of context, string them all together.
Despite the Prime Minister's views, independent economists say the government's way of presenting figures is not reputable.
They used exactly the same sort of triple counting, rolling forward device as has been used to account for the apparent £1 billion savings in management costs in the NHS.
So what do you think of the way they presented the increase as 21 billion?
Well, it was straightforwardly misleading, and the government were criticised by House of Commons Public Accounts Committee and many others on this point.
You had a whole panorama programme on this issue a year ago.
18
billion is true. 3 billion, 6 billion, 9 billion is true. A faster rate of increase of NHS spending than the NHS has enjoyed for the whole of its history. Also true.
I'm talking about the way you presented it. I'm not talking about the size of the increase. I'm talking about the way you presented these figures. Was it an honest way of presenting the figures? Because the Prime Minister staked out some very high moral ground at the last election, didn't he? He said he'd forge a new bond of trust with the people.
18 billion is true. You went over all of this in last year's panorama. 18 billion was true.
Well, that's
3 billion, 6 billion, 9 billion. That's true.
Triple
a
counted.
faster
Triple
rate
counted.
of increase in NHS spending than over the rest of the history of the NHS. Even more true.
Last year, the government again announced a spending increase with the launch of the NHS plan.
Speaker, with your permission, I would like to make a statement on the National Health Service plan.
This time, the annual increases of over 6% until 2004 were real, and they matched the biggest on record. Mr. Blair says the new investment is already delivering. It is true that the biggest hospital building programme is now underway. It's being funded mostly by private companies, who the public purse will have to repay over 30 years. The problem is, as Panorama showed earlier this year, there aren't yet the staff to operate all the new wards, so some are closing.
We do not close wards every day, thank goodness. So this is more pressure today. It's not good fun, it's not a good day, but we're doing the best we can.
This ward had to temporarily close. Mr. Blair acknowledges there's a lot to do, but he's also claimed he's done a lot.
We have laid the foundations for that. This extra investment has now been going into the health service. There are some 17,000 extra nurses, 6,700 doctors that are now in post.
Once again, that's not quite as it seems. Many of those extra nurses are part-time. The full-time equivalent is nearer 11,000. That still leaves around 15,000 vacancies. A big expansion of medical schools is now underway, but most of the extra doctors Mr. Blair claims credit for were in the pipeline anyway.
I mean, these are long-term things. I mean, it takes time to train medical people, and you've got to recognise that. I don't think the government could take credit for the numbers of doctors and nurses coming through now. They really shouldn't do. I mean, those are doctors and nurses coming through training places set up some years ago.
So what about the future? All three parties say they aim to deliver a world-class service, though Mr. Blair's rhetoric perhaps has been the most vivid.
Mr. Blair has said that under New Labour, the NHS will become the most envied healthcare system in the world. From being close to bottom in the health spending league of European Union countries, according to the Prime Minister, by 2005, we'll be up there with the average.
Even that seems unlikely. New Labour are committed to their present spending increases only until 2004. According to the King's Fund, even if they continue these increases to 2005, the gap between Britain and the EU may even have widened since New Labour came to power. The Prime Minister defended his record on health in a BBC question and answer session with voters last week.
Your manifesto promises for the health service are very much echoes of 4 years ago. Given this is a clear indication of your failure to achieve the results you wanted, why should we trust you again?
We made actually pretty limited promises on 4 years ago in respect of waiting lists in particular. But I've got absolutely no doubt at all we've still got a massive amount to do.
You said 48 hours to save the national health, didn't you?
I said 24 hours.
24 hours to save the National Health Service. Well, that's quite a big promise.
Yeah, but I didn't say within 24 hours I've transformed the whole of the National Health Service. What I said was that because of the Conservative proposals at that election, as incidentally with this election, are to push people out into private medical insurance, it was important that people voted for the party that believes in the National Health Service. However, I am the first to accept There is a massive amount still to do in the National Health Service. But I do say this to you, the only way we're going to deal with the problems that still exist in the health service, the problems of people waiting too long, the problems of insufficient nurses, insufficient doctors and consultants, the problems of having insufficient hospital buildings. The only way we're going to deal with this is to carry on making the investment in the National Health Service. And if we cut that investment back, as the Conservative plans would mean, that would be a disaster for the future of the National Health Service.
The Tories are committed to spending as much as New Labour on health, but like New Labour, only for the next 3 years. They believe one way of raising spending is to expand the private sector, so they're offering tax breaks to those who take the burden off the NHS by paying privately for treatment.
Why should the British people trust the Conservatives to run the health service, though, after 18 years, when waiting lists almost tripled, actually, from the early 80s to when you left office? And you left, as I say, the health service with such a staff crisis. Why should people trust you to not do that again?
We know that in the past, the NHS has been an area where the public have viewed the Conservatives with suspicion, and it has been a matter of political difficulty for us. We are committed, both because we believe it is the right thing to do, and because it is also in government the successful thing for us to do politically, to succeed with the NHS.
The Liberal Democrats are pledged to spend £2 billion more each year than New Labour and the Tories, and throughout the whole Parliament. But, having never been in government before, their ability to deliver remains untested.
$2 billion sounds a lot of money, but actually it'll only increase the health spending as a share of GDP, our national wealth, by a 0.2% per year. It's not a lot, is it? It's not as much as it sounds.
Well, we accept that it does not solve the long-term problem of our health service. We're not suggesting it does. What it will do is make a realistic ability to deliver on reducing the time that people are waiting for treatment. I think we do accept that there will have to be a hard rethink of the long-term investment in the NHS, where other countries like France and Germany spend more. But we are anxious to be specific about what the taxpayer can fund and what that money will buy in very objective terms.
In British terms, the health spending plans of all three parties may seem ambitious, but a world-class service will require sustained funding for much longer than any of them have committed to, whether from taxes, from more people going private, or from a mixture of both.
It's nearly 40 years that we've been below the European Union average, or in other words, countries like France and Germany have been investing in healthcare at a higher level for much longer than the UK.
This can't be fixed by one or even two parliaments, can it?
No, I think we're in for a long haul, and I think it's not just the government, but the public must recognise that if they really want the investment in the health service to produce some results, it will take a long time.
On education, Mr. Blair's ambitions back in 1997 were even greater than they were for the NHS. Like our hospitals, our schools, he said, would become beacons to the world. The Prime Minister said education was his passion. It should be the nation's moral purpose.
Ask me my three main priorities for government, and I tell you, education, education, and education.
The liberation of human potential, says Mr. Blair, is the key to our economic and social revival.
Give me the education system that's 35th in the world today, and I will give you the economy that's 35th in the world tomorrow.
As with health, 4 years ago, New Labour's political broadcasts played on fears that the Tories would run down schools.
I mean, your children are your future, Tom. And there's a whole generation who only know about rundown schools. Well, that's no good, is it? How's she going to learn in an overcrowded classroom? I'll tell you, it'll be difficult to find a decent school.
When I say education, 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 what that means is not just all the specifics of policy. It means I am going to put every single bit of drive and energy that I've got into changing the education system of this country. For me, education is the big passion.
Mr. Blair said he'd be radical in government. The manifesto said New Labour would be a pioneer of new thinking. But how true was that for priority number one?
Well, the remarkable thing is they came to power criticising Conservative education policy as really its great failure. But what they've done is actually taken over a large tranche of that policy. They've accepted the national curriculum, put in place further tests, beefed up the inspection service, and continued with financial delegation to schools. All of these things were bitterly opposed by the Labour Party in opposition, but they've become the central planks of its education policy.
With his impassioned rhetoric in '97 came Mr. Blair's contract with the people, but like health it seemed less ambitious than the rhetoric. The manifesto promised to cut class sizes to under 30, but only for 5, 6 and 7-year-olds.
It's true, isn't it, that they have kept their promise on primary schools?
Yes, and it was a very good promise. I mean, one of the odd things about our education system is that we have fewer teachers in relation to the number of pupils in primary schools than we do secondary schools. So quite right to focus on bringing down the pupil-teacher ratio there. However, although the targets have been met, we have to bear in mind that the number of pupils have been falling. So it has taken hardly any extra teachers to actually achieve that target. It would, to a large extent, happened anyway.
I vow that class sizes will be down in primary schools and standards up in all schools.
And there have been dramatic increases in children meeting literacy, numeracy and science targets. For 11-year-olds, up more than 10% for English, 13% for maths, and 16% for science. But while there have been advances in primary schools, there have been setbacks in secondary schools. Last year, pupil-teacher ratios were the highest since 1976, partly because the number of pupils has been growing. There are now nearly 90,000 more in classes over 30 than 4 years ago. As with health, New Labour inherited a growing teacher crisis.
Would you accept that you bequeathed to New Labour, as you did with health, a staff crisis?
No, I wouldn't. And I think if you listen to what the teacher unions have said over the last few months, they describe the present teacher shortages and supply crisis as unprecedented. I heard a particular teacher union leader say it was the worst for a decade. Now, of course, if one goes back a decade...
It was growing under you, under the Conservatives. It was getting worse year by year, particularly towards the end of your time in office. There is inevitably a sense in which we were growing the economy, we were growing employment, and some of the pressures on employment were occurring under the Conservatives as they have done since. But it has worsened significantly.
It's Monday morning at the Times educational supplement, Bible of the teaching profession. The faxes are rolling. The paper has already started receiving adverts for job vacancies.
Last year, we had unprecedented volumes of teachers' ads. It was a record year last year, but even that has been overwhelmed this year by a 70% increase on that record level.
Since New Labour came to power, vacancy levels in secondary schools have trebled. Vacancies in primary schools have doubled. For maths teachers, the vacancy rate has increased 5-fold.
The whole departments in some schools are missing. There are schools that have no maths teachers at all, or may only have one maths teacher, where they need 4 or 5. That situation will get worse and it will be uneven.
When he was in opposition 5 years ago, the man who became Secretary of State for Education, David Blunkett, described the growing teacher shortage as a ticking time bomb. The assumption was that if New Labour became the government, they'd move swiftly to defuse it, but they didn't.
We said the number one priority would be education.
It hasn't shown the urgency in finding enough teachers that you might have expected. When David Blunkett was in opposition, he was talking about the problem as being a ticking time bomb. But when he came to power, he seemed to forget that. So it's a cumulative problem. It was bad when New Labour came to power, it's worse now.
So whatever happened to education, education, education? Why had a government whose leader had spoken so passionately about education, who had vowed in his contract with the people to raise education to the nation's priority number one, why had such a government not got to grips straight away with the growing teacher shortage crisis? The answer, of course, lies with New Labour's manifesto pledge on spending. As with health, it committed the government to stick to Tory limits for the first 2 years, but it also committed them to reversing what they called the Tory trend of cutting education spending.
And I repeat the promise that I made at the election, that over the lifetime of this Parliament, we will reverse the Tory policy of cutting spending on education as a proportion of our national income and raise it once again, beginning with the £1 billion extra next year.
Nonetheless, education spending for the next year, as a proportion of our national wealth, fell to lower than all the Tory years. Partly this was because of higher than expected economic growth. The proportion was just as low in the third year too. Yet to listen to Mr. Blair then, we were set for the start of a 3-year spending bonanza.
We are rising as a government to that challenge. £19 billion extra spending.
That extra spending was promised over 3 years. In fact, it didn't kick in until last year. And even then, it wasn't quite what it seemed. The government had used the same triple counting methods it had used for health to present the increase as £19 billion. In reality, it was nearer to 10.
We've done more than we ever promised. And where we've made promises, we are keeping them.
It wasn't until last year, the 4th year of New Labour, that the promise was kept. Then education spending as a share of national wealth finally exceeded the last year of the major government by 0.2%.
Our goal is to make Britain the best educated and skilled country in the world.
Well, I think the expectations generated by New Labour have led people to be looking forward to too much. In fact, there are some substantial achievements that the government has to its credit. The literacy and numeracy schemes in primary schools, for example, creating places in nursery education, rising performance at GCSE and A-level, continuing something that was happening before. All of these are achievements, but they seem very little in relation to the reforms that the country was led to expect when New Labour came to power.
Over the last 4 years, the education system that has been underfunded for so long has become increasingly overwhelmed. What solution to this crisis are the 3 main parties offering? Since last summer, the government has committed itself to big increases in education spending, although the increase is not quite as much as health, so it's still not quite priority number one. But the government is paying teachers more, and it is providing more teacher training places. Mr. Blair says this will deliver an extra 10,000 teachers by 2005. How close will we be then to the Prime Minister's goal of having the best education system in the world?
Well, 10,000 extra teachers will ameliorate the situation, but it won't take us back to the pupil-teacher ratios of even 10 years ago.
Under the Tories?
Under the Conservative government, yes. And I don't know really how to put this into context, but for example, the ratio of teachers to pupils in state schools is about half that in independent schools. So even to move in that direction, you're going to be looking for 100,000 teachers or perhaps 200,000 teachers. 10,000 has to be seen in relation to that.
The woman in lilac there. Sorry, then
And Mr. Blair faced some clear frustration on this subject from a BBC audience of voters this week.
I'm worse off. I'm a secondary school teacher and I'd like to know where my taxes go because it certainly doesn't go into secondary schools and education.
Well,
Certainly there is a lot of investment that has gone into schools. I mean, into primary schools, as you know. I'm just coming to secondary schools. Into primary schools count as well, you know.
I know.
Into primary schools, there's been a very large investment that's gone into capital stock as well as the schools themselves, and that's one of the reasons why we've got the best ever primary school results in this country. Now, in secondary schools, as you will know, this year your secondary school should have received money direct to the head teacher. When we came to office, the funding per pupil had been cut by something like £30. It's been increased significantly, but again, over the next few years, there is a very substantial additional investment going into secondary school.
Liberal Democrats are pledging £3 billion a year more than New Labour